Loughborough University. Okay, I thought, tagline for the conference, Back to the Future. So I have a T-shirt that has a DeLorean on, which I thought would be useful. And I thought, you've got to start your talk, Gary, surely with some quotes from Back to the Future. And I thought this one might be quite relevant. Roads where we're going, we don't need roads. Mull this one over for a while. This one seemed perhaps even more appropriate, particularly given what I'm going to be talking about. You're sort of looking at generational change here. And I'm going to be sort of talking about the pros and cons generally of immersive tech in the education sector, particularly higher education. Sort of a few examples based on things that sort of crazy teaching that I've been up to the last 4 years or so. But I'm going to go on to something that's perhaps even more fantastical, and the move potentially towards hologram type displays, which is something we're exploring at Loughborough University, and sort of hot off the press. We've only just done the first sort of test lectures using hologram technology. So I want to talk about that, and that's a very different sort of take on immersive tech. Okay, just a bit of background to kick off on. There's huge potential for extended reality more generally, virtual reality, mixed reality, augmented reality, etc. And of course, the technology has matured massively over the last 5 to 10 years or so. But this has come up several times in the conference already. There's a whole thing about new need for skills. Students, as they move into the workforce, are increasingly going to be using these technologies. They need to know about them in a whole variety of different ways. They're going to be more and more part of their everyday lives going forward. There's a whole thing in the higher education sector about demands on physical spaces. We don't have enough spaces that can cope with this number of students, etc. There's obviously the whole climate change argument as well about sort of students moving around and sort of transport and travel and physical infrastructure costs, etc. And of course there's a whole thing around changing student expectations as they come through through the different experiences as children into the world of universities, and also the whole sort of global learner perspective. If I sort of summarize sort of many of the positives associated with immersive technology, then you're going to make arguments around access, regardless of your local infrastructure. You could put on a headset and you could be there with high quality learning from anywhere in the world potentially. There's always big arguments around engagement, that it's very novel and it sort of brings people in and people are excited, etc. There's a whole sort of flexibility. You can personalize, you've got control over the pixels, you can do different things for different learners. When it comes to learning theories, experientialism comes up a lot. We can, learning while doing, in that type of thing. From my perspective, I've always been very interested in students as avatars and what that means for their learning as well. The sort of whole socialization thing's really important. And then there's a whole thing of context. You can be embedded in the context that's relevant to the learning. We're learning about volcanoes, let's go to a volcano. These type of things are really, really powerful. In terms of sort of theory, there's lots of theories out there, but this is the one I like the most. And the reason I like it most is because it signifies what's different. What's different about this technology compared to doing things, for instance, in person? And it really comes down to the two things in blue: presence and agency. Okay? The presence, the illusion that I'm somewhere else, with different people who aren't actually there with me, interacting with objects that aren't really there. And all of that sort of thing can be very, very powerful in a variety of different ways. And the other one is agency, your ability to be able to start doing different things that you couldn't do in the real world, to be able to take different perspectives, to make the small sort of mice on my scale. These type of things are really powerful. And that takes me to sort of good old Jeremy Bailinson from Stanford and the sort of DICE criteria. I always feel it should be called DICER because there's an extra word on the end there of rare. But this sort of helps serve the use cases that are relevant. We should think about the use of immersive tech in situations where in the real world it would be either dangerous, impossible, counterproductive, expensive or rare. Okay, to do those things. And that puts us into all sorts of interesting areas that you might think. So, I took a couple of my students on the top right one there, on a tour of the heart. I can't get into a real heart. That's impossible. Okay, it's also dangerous to have medics experimenting on real hearts. So there's a whole interesting thing there about, woo woo. But then for history of art students, you know, expensive to take them off to Florence to go and look at a Florentine church, but get a high quality photogrammetry.
Oh, see, off you go, take off time.
Sorry, my terrible voice. Ooh. And we can, but we can take different perspectives. We can't start flying in a real Florentine church and start and look at these things right up close and talk about them together. And we can't be raccoons either. Okay, so wonderful, amazing. But what are the key concerns here? What are the sort of the limitations, the challenges? And there are many of them, and I've put various ones up in there. There's a whole thing about, is this actually valid? Are we getting proven sort of impacts on learning? There's whole sort of, you know, equity, societal impact, ethics, etc., things like that. The two I'm going to pick out here, because it feeds into what I'll go on to talk about next, are the two in the top right in red. There will always be health and safety arguments around headsets with the sort of the current technology and the way that's going. There will always be some students that feel sick, that have dizziness, where this is a problem. And so we have to be really aware of those sorts of issues. And there is also, particularly with current technology, there's a whole usability thing. The onboarding takes time, and this will get better. But it will get better as it becomes more ingrained in students' everyday life. But that is still, and will probably be maintained for several years, a barrier. Okay, right. So I'm going to just do a quick thing on some of my teaching with extended reality. Then I'm going to move on to the hologram stuff. So when I was at Nottingham, I taught a module about virtual reality in virtual reality. So I only knew my students as avatars. And this was like quite a big thing, and sort of, you know, lots of papers and stuff like from that. And it became really popular. It went from about 30 pre-COVID to last year 130. So it became final year optional module. And there's all sorts of interesting issues around what happens when your students are all, you know, are all avatars, and turns out they don't tend to look like themselves. As avatars. They were like being cartoon animals, their favourite video game character and stuff like that. There's a whole set of things there. At Loughborough, there's been more sort of doing sort of teaching in a VR lab type space, but looking at more specifically at learning outcomes that might be facilitated. So we've been teaching students in inclusive design about empathy by putting them into the bodies of others. So what would it be like to use a cash point, to use an ATM when you're in a wheelchair? What's it like to cross the road when you've got glaucoma? And this is really, really powerful stuff, and VR is really good for this. It's hitting that eye for impossible. You know, maybe we could give students glasses and get them crossing the road, but we'd have all sorts of issues, risk assessments for this type of thing. So you know, VR is really good for this. And we've also got into sort of soft skills stuff. You know, let's do some sort of fantastical team building activity. You've got to find your way around the maze, and one of your teammates is a giant and can help you find your way around the maze. And these sorts of things are really good for sort of bringing sort of a bond to students. Right, okay. So I mainly want to talk about this holographic technology. I'm about 10 minutes through, okay. So this is the sort of new technology that sort of the university's invested in. I'll show it. There's the big box. Excuse me. There's the big box and there's the little box. The big box is human-sized, and you'll see it up in the top right now.
In front of it all.
There's me.
Okay.
And there's me. So this is pretty powerful stuff in terms of the sort of technology. I won't go into how it works. You can ask me that, you know, at the end or in the break. But the most obvious use case for this, for the university, is remote teaching. Instead of paying for a guest speaker to come all the way over from the other side of the globe, we can beam them into the classroom, and they can be there with the students, you know, measure the concept of presence, and we give a lecture, interact with the students, etc. This is the most obvious use case from a sort of sustainability sort of perspective. But there's also the three other ones I think for me are potentially the most interesting longer term ones. The one is that you can start to get high quality recorded content. Maybe you're teaching law students, lawyers, about sort of witness statements, and you can have a performance by an actor, and the students can watch that and sort of interrogate sort of what they think about that witness statement. So there's a lot of different things that you could do here. The other thing is getting students to show off themselves and show off their digital content within the box. You know, I work with a lot of fashion students who go, you know, this fashion student comes in, talks about their project, go, hey, here's this new handbag that I've created. Here it is. And this sort of magical theatre thing can be really interesting. And then there's a whole set of different things about AI avatars, whether or not that's living people or recently dead people or people who've been dead for a long period of time, being very sort of present there in the box. So just the example of the student-generated content, this is the first example down just with a small box. We're just starting to create some sort of 3D content. So it's just a little cartoon character with a spinning logo, and just to sort of get an idea of what sort of things you can do. Right, okay, so I'm going to talk about some of the things we've done so far. So this is hot off the press. It's only just 2 weeks ago we did our first mini lectures using this hologram, the big hologram box. There were 2 small lectures. These were students that were invited in, just a small number of students in the first place, to come in and see a hologram lecture. There were 2 of us who did this, 2 different topics. I was the one talking about occupant packaging in vehicles. Nothing to do with holograms, just of general interest for these set of students. And you can see in the sort of you can see the sort of student perspective there in 2 of the images. So where you can see that, it's not going to come up there. And you can see the sort of the lab space, if you like, in terms of the performance.
Planning tools with the more modern agile planning tools for running projects. And what I've got on the slide there for you is kind of a summarised, cut down version of one of the tables in their paper. And they talk about 2 types of teams in their paper, so transient project teams and stable.
And you can see me now in the same set of students a little bit later.
I want to say a bit about why it's important, and I want to get into...
See the students' phones coming up? There's quite a lot of that. Okay, so I'll talk about the sort of things. There's a small number of students just testing this out. So all these students were surveyed. First thing to say is, if you look, most of these questions are about to what extent they believe that the lecturer was there with them. And it's quite apparent from that data that there's a strong view that that hologram speaker was there with me, and they were watching me, they were aware of me, that they were sentient, conscious and alive to me. There's no sense that this is a recording or that this is, a screen. This is generally a view that that a person's there. Now, we did this sort of analysis, essentially comparing the holograms to in-person teaching. And essentially, the closer that gets to 50% in those different questions, there's questions on satisfaction, engagement, distraction, and learning. The closer that gets to 50%, the closer that is to what they think of in terms of in-person. And most of those are pretty close to 50%. If you then did ask the same questions, but now in relation to video conferencing teaching, clearly this is different. So essentially, this is much closer to in-person teaching than it is to video conferencing teaching, okay, in the student's perspective. Now, one thing that's also interesting here is about the likelihood of different behaviours. So do students sort of feel that the lecturer's still in control, an authority figure here? Do they feel that the lecturer, that they might do other things that they wouldn't do if the person was there in the room with them? And this gets interesting again. So most of these are still close to 50% for in-person teaching, but there did seem to be a more positive view about whether they would arrive early or arrive late in relation to this. Not quite sure why. We need to unpack that a bit more. But there's clearly lots of greens there that are quite strong in relation to in-person teaching. So they clearly felt they were much less likely to eat food or drink. They were much more likely much less likely to eat food or drink and more likely to pay attention to teaching activity and things like that. Now, the comments are the most interesting thing, I think, from all of this. there's a few different themes that are coming out from this. So the first one is really all those things about presence. It felt like that person was in the room with me. It was really interesting. They were engaged with me. And one of the things, if you look down when you do this and you look down the lens of the camera, all students will feel like you're looking at them. Okay, which is very, very interesting. But the way we had it set up, we had slides on the side, so every so often you sort of looked across the slides, which is more problematic. It would be much better if the slides were right as close as possible to the camera in terms of the slide, you looking at your own slides. There was a whole novelty thing in here. I enjoyed the novelty and trying to work it out. It's like a conundrum. Are they really there? There was a whole thing of focus. I felt excited. I had more focus on what the speaker said. Again, that hologram caught my eyes, which was very interesting. But so a few people point out the sound didn't sound that great on here, but the sound quality was actually very good coming from this. And it felt like sound was coming from the box. And there was a whole thing about the sort of, the technology. They sort of picking out the technology sort of, seemed to work really well. But there were negative stuff as well that came out from it. So there was a whole thing about distraction. So I'm just spending so much time looking at the hologram, I'm not thinking about the lecture. Okay, and you've got to remember that this was also this isn't part of any of their program. They didn't need to know about these topics, so they weren't naturally engaged, but then they volunteered to come along. There was a whole thing about interaction. This was tricky for us. We didn't have the sound working. It was hard to do sort of two-way type interaction, so it was more one-way generally. But we're aware of how we can sort of deal with that. And there was some sort of tech issues. It felt very bright. There was a bit of lag. They felt at one point, because I started doing a few things with props, I affected my background, and then they could see a little gap in there, and they became conscious of that. And there was another thing, that the lecture room itself wasn't really very well set up for this. It wasn't a great lecture theatre. It was more of a seminar type space, and this would work much better for a space like this, to be honest. Take this podium out and put me in a hologram box, and it's just, that would work pretty well. Okay, we surprised them with some questions at the end related to the lecture, and they didn't know this was coming, and there were 5 questions, and they were all multi-choice. Four options. So random would be 25% here. So across those 5 questions, they seemed to do pretty well, which was quite nice for both mine and for Vicky's lecture. And this is just the individual students. There were 12 students who've completed this. And there were a couple of students who got all the questions right. There were 5 questions. And there's one student who only got 2 of them right. But generally there was sort of an awareness here. Now the other thing here is, for my last few slides or so, is what is the perspective of the teacher here? Okay, and there's 2 of us, and we've talked about this. I didn't feel I was with them. They felt I was with them, but I didn't feel I was with them. Yeah, that makes sense. And this is partly because my view of them was just a tiny sort of tablet at a distance, so it's really hard to see any individual student. So if that was a big TV, this would be so much better. Okay, so that's an obvious sort of improvement to this. I didn't feel I had the natural agency. In the same way, I don't feel I have the natural agency here. If I was teaching now, I'd be off all over the place. Okay, whereas, so I'm sort of tied to this podium here, and it felt the same there. I was tied in. I was basically, I'm in a box. Let me out of the box. So it was, this is sort of, it's an interesting one. And I didn't have that same sense of my slides, because my slides weren't there with me. They were somewhere else. I had to go, my slides over there, no, over there, etc. So it's that type of thing. I found it actually really useful to bring in props. Physical stuff, and because I was talking about car design and sort of anthropometry, sort of etc., I started doing sort of crazy things, which the students picked up on. Actually, I'm going to bring in a chair.
Okay, so you've got more of a sports car type thing.
I started talking about the difference between the sort of the ergonomics of a sports car versus an SUV. You can start to see them. How clear it is. The students' phones coming out at this point.
SUV sort of sitting right up.
But you could do all sorts of things potentially here. Okay, conclusions so far on this. There was clearly engagement. They appeared to be learning, which was good, even though they didn't come there to learn. Particularly, they came to sort of see a hologram lecture. There's distraction, I think, is definitely a possibility here, at least in the first case with this type of technology. The phones all come out, basically. This is much closer to in-person than it is to a video conference session, for sure, and the perception lecturer is present with them. Interactivity is hard here. We need to do various things with the tech to make that much better. I felt you could still have authority over the class. I think this is a really interesting one because it gets into the role of a moderator in here. Do you need to have a sort of someone sort of in control in the room, or is there a sense that you can have control over the class? And there's a whole thing about where the box is actually located in relation to slides, in relation to the students themselves. So a few students who were watching from side on were more aware that of the technological limitations here. It was much better for students that were a little bit further back. What we're doing with it next, effectively, is, we need to analyse videos. We're going to do more test trials over the summer in different locations with more students, with better two-way interactions. And we want to think more, I personally want to think much more beyond the sort of the remote speaker, guest lecturer type use case. I want to think about recording scenarios that I can then play back to students for discussion. I want to start mixing real and digital content within this technology. And I want to get into AI avatars because this gets very, very interesting very, very quickly. So, and this is me on a avatar scale from low fidelity to high fidelity, Gary. Okay, thank you very much.